QSO Today, episode 470, Tony Fishpool, G4WIF. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. I want to thank Robert Culver, VK5RC, who became a $100 annual sponsor this week, and we have an anonymous donation of $100. My thanks for your support of the QSO Today podcast and now the QSO Today Academy. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. My friend and colleague Ben Bresky, who has been editing the QSO Today podcast for years, as well as hundreds of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo videos, has compiled a fabulous work of 5-minute podcasts called The Jewish Moment, an often historical look at the land of Israel, the people, and its interesting places and events. If this subject interests you, there is a link to Ben's podcast in the right sidebar of the show notes pages at QSOtoday.com. The Academy event on demand ends this weekend. If you're a ticket holder and wish to continue to access the Academy resources, please become a listener sponsor today. The cost is $10 per month or save over 20% of the cost of $100 annually. Your listener sponsorship keeps the light on here, as well as the hosting resources that we use to generate and host the QSO Today content. In the course of the 6 QSO Today Virtual Ham Expos and now the QSO Today Academy event, I have spent a lot of time and money on building automation to reduce the workload to produce these events. That being said, since August 1st, my head has been down to get the Academy event on track and executed and prepare it for its regular monthly use. To this end, I will have a QSO Today presentation on October 16th at 1800 PDT Pacific to present the QSO Today Academy, its forums, resources, and classrooms. Please save the date and come. It is a free ticket for anyone to access. I hope that the Academy will have at least one monthly presentation of interest to hams, perhaps more. The week after the QSO Today Academy, the High Holy Days for Jews began with Rosh Hashanah. In Israel, this kicks off almost a month of activity, making it difficult to record new podcasts. It is a beautiful time of the year here, with lots of tourists and vacation days being used. I had 2 interviews scheduled during this period, but both canceled at the very last minute. However, with over 400 interviews in the can since 2014, I chose a very special interview that I had with Tony Fishpool, G4WIF, that I conducted in March of 2017. Tony is still active in the United Kingdom's GQRP Club and contributes to the quarterly Sprat magazine. He's the author of a book on test equipment for the QRPer and numerous articles on equipment building with particular attention to detail and budget. I am pleased to present you this re-edited and mastered QSO with Tony Fishpool, G4WIF. 4X1MK, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Ron?
4Z1UG, this is 4X1MK, your station for good QSOs.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Thank you. Well, I would say that started with the building of my first communication device when maybe I was 5 or 6 years old, which was 2 tin cans with a string in between them. And I was fascinated by this. And to the point, sometime later, and I don't know when, I had a prophetic dream. I'm standing on a mountaintop with one of these tin cans, and the string is dangling out into the air. And I'm talking to people on this thing. So that seemed to harbinger things to come. However, we'll get that. That's just a little thing to start with. I think that the real impetus was like a 1919 or 1920 book of knowledge, which my parents had the whole set, and there was plans to build a crystal radio in there, and I was in grade 6 at the time, and our science teacher, this is at King Edward School in Toronto, Mr. Harold Timpson, may his memory be blessed, during the lunch hour, for the kids who didn't go home during the hour, he opened up his classroom and people could build all kinds of projects. So I started there looking in microscope and sketching down things I saw, but guys were building radios there. And so I came to him with this book of knowledge one day, and he gave me some 1N34 diode instead of a cat's whisker crystal. And in short, I built the first crystal radio, and he had a pair of earphones and had a wire antenna on the roof of the school. When I put those earphones on and heard music coming out from these handful of parts, I was transfixed. I guess that's what you call a life-changing moment. And he encouraged me along. He wasn't a ham himself, but the next project I built a code practice oscillator with a 2N107 transistor, and then an audio amplifier with a 2N107 for the crystal set. And then he saw I was really into this, and he found a plan in a radio, one of these old radio, maybe one of these Gernsback publications, for a 1-tube regenerative receiver with a 1U5 tube. So I built one of those, got some plug-in coils, could hear shortwave and hams. And things progressed. I had to wait till I was 15 years old to get a ham license, because in Canada, that was the minimum age for getting a ham license. So that was kind of frustrating. Learning code, I have to say that my mother was kind of an Elmer for me on that, because she had helped her cousin, Irving Liss of blessed memory, VE3XU, I guess back in the 20s or 30s, study for his ham license, and she helped him learn the code. She had all kinds of mnemonic devices for remembering the letters. So when my 15th birthday in 1965 rolled around, I think, exactly 1 month after my birthday, my mom drove me down to the Ministry of Transport offices in Toronto. I was so scared. I was never so scared for an exam in my life, as nervous as I was for that one. I was shaking. I said, Mama, I don't think I could do it. I don't want to get out of the car. And she forced me out of the car, went up to the building and took the test and was given VE3 GAG. And the rest is, well, it's all history.
And I'm sure that your ham friends gave you no lack of shellacking on GAG.
Yeah, they called me Gag. That's right. There was, at that time, that blocker was Gas, and there was Gay, and there was Gad, and Gad. I remember those guys. The guys who got their tickets at that time.
I remember, too, being horrified because, you spent months and months studying for the exam that you actually take at in your case, at the Ministry of Transport, but in the States, it was at the FCC field office.
Oh, yeah. I remember, I finished the test. I don't know, I shouldn't take up too much time with this, but yeah, you took the Morse test, and then they gave you the written test to write out. Then you have to wait, and I'm waiting for the guys to come into the room to take the test. Maybe I should have gone out and called them, but I was just sitting there frightened for about an hour waiting for them to come back in.
So you have your first license. What was your first rig?
Yeah, the HE30 Lafayette receiver, or known as a TR9R59. 8-tube receiver, which I got I'd saved all my bar mitzvah money to buy that. And my transmitter was a ARC-5 BC696, which I used on 80 meters. And I put into service as well a wireless set number 19, which I've heard, I think some of your interviewees, more the Canadians and Brits, talked about them. That I operated that on as a 40-meter transmitter.
And those also looked like the Arc 5. I mean, they all kind of had the same look, didn't they?
Well, the number 19 set was this big, massive thing with Russian writing on the front, because they built these things in the Lend-Lease program, and also for the Russians in fighting the Nazis in the Second World War. It was a 2 to 8 megahertz transceiver, CW, AM, modulated CW. It also had a little set in it which worked around 240 megahertz, which was a super-regen. And actually, I changed the coil in that and got that to receive 2-meter AM so I could hear the hams.
And do you remember your first contact?
Yeah, my first contact was my buddy Ivan, VE3FSQ, today VE3DO, and a world-class 160-meter fanatic. We prearranged the contact, and we worked fine. And then I let myself loose.
Smooth sailing from then.
Oh, yeah.
So you're 15 years old. You're in high school. Was there a high school radio club?
Yes. There was the Central Tech High School VE3ED club. Had a nice vertical antenna. I subsequently had bought a DX100B transmitter used from somebody. I remember taking it down they had a very nice Eddystone receiver, a British receiver. And I brought for open night, open house at the school. I brought down a DX100B and hooked it up. It had a vertical, I remember calling CQ and having some guy in Italy come back, which was a real gas.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yeah, well, definitely. And I have to say, just that I think ham radio has been woven into my life. All the different things I've done and still do, it's all interconnected with ham radio. I just want to interject this thing that ham radio is the most fantastic networking device that exists, because it's real. It's not just virtual. It's real people, and you get out there and you meet them and so on. But getting back to that, so I, of course, like so many of your interviewees, wanted to be electrical or electronic engineers. So for that reason, I went to Central Technical School. And in fact, a lot of my family and relatives were saying, "What's a nice Jewish boy going to a technical school? You should be a doctor or a lawyer," or something like that. Actually, my grandfather, he was very much in favor of this. He was a watchmaker, and he had disrespect for anybody who didn't know how to make things with their hands. So he was glad I was getting into that thing.
You were at Central Technical High School in Toronto, and you're pursuing a technical line rather than a classic college prep line.
So I thought I was. It was they had the 5-year course in Ontario at that time. There was grade 13, which was a prerequisite to go to university. So I wanted to get into engineering. However, in one's teens, in my teens, the hormones were running around in my body and interfering with my thinking, and I had trouble with the maths, and I got into the higher grades. And I couldn't follow it. There were a few geniuses at the front of the class who were following the teacher, the math teacher, the physics teacher, and the rest of us, if you missed one step, you lost it. So I saw I had little choice. So I dropped in grade 13, I dropped the physics and the math and took French for another credit, took a history course. And my academic career, which I have to take a break after high school for a year, which I'll tell you about shortly. The academic, I went into philosophy, religious, and Near Eastern studies. Okay, why is that? Now, at the time, my formative years, I also fell into a group called Habonim, which is a group, young people interested in Israel and kibbutz, and I thought this was really neat. In fact, my family was of this vein of thought. I think ever since my grandfather, my grandparents had fled Europe and the persecution and the slaughtering of Jews over there, they felt that our people couldn't really be a normal people if we didn't have independence of our own country. And I was influenced by that kind of thinking. And then in this group I went to, we'd have Friday night meetings and talk about the kibbutz, which is a communal way of life. And it seemed to make a lot of sense. It's like a utopian community that everybody equal and sharing everything. It sounded really neat. Anyways, I went through the whole course of the youth movement with the summer camps. I even I took radio gear to the summer camps and operated portable from there. Between when I finished high school, I went to Israel for a year in the Habonim program. That was actually the 1 year ever since I got my license that I wasn't active because I didn't have any gear. But being here in Israel for that year really interested me what's going on. And in all the different cultures in the Middle East and so on, it opened my eyes. So when I got back to university, and I got to go to university, and I wasn't going to be taking electrical engineering because I didn't have the math prerequisites, so what am I going to study? So I already decided I was going to come back here and live after I finished university. So I thought, just take interesting stuff. And being of a philosophical bent, I took philosophy, and I was interested in this area and so on. I took Middle Eastern studies. I took a course in Hebrew and advanced Hebrew and so on. And also we had a very nice club at the University of Toronto, VE3U of T, which I taught Morse code there to aspiring people. I don't know if maybe somebody got a license from those I taught Morse code to. And I remember that somebody, a ham who I'd met in Israel when I was here for that year, Tzion, 4X4IK, was then at Kibbutz Beit Emek. I worked them from the club station at the university, which was beautiful. So that was also a real gas.
You got interested in Habonim. It kind of set your sights for moving to Israel. What happened after that?
Yeah, by the way, I should say that moving to Israel solved the conflict, the Friday night conflict I had. Because every Friday night was Habonim, but also once a month was the West Side Radio Club of Toronto. So coming to Israel, I solved that conflict because this is a radio club all year round. Anyways, but there was a great radio club and some great people. So coming back here, and this follows the professional realm. So the first few years, I worked in agriculture in the kibbutz.
How did you get here, and what did you bring?
Well, I came with a group of people from Habonim that we had spent time in this year program, either the year I was in or the year before it, who had been in the same kibbutz. So we liked the kibbutz very much. We formed a gar'in, means a seed, a group of people. And we had already decided we were going to settle in this kibbutz. We knew the people, we liked it.
And which kibbutz was that?
Urim. Urim is where I still live today, which is about, if you draw a straight line between Beersheba or Beersheba and the Israeli-Egyptian border at the Mediterranean Sea, you take a straight line, and right in the middle of that line, that's where I'm at. Kilo Mike 72 Gulf Hotel is the grid locator. So, anyways, when I got to the airport, and one of the members of the kibbutz picked me up, and the first thing he said, "Did you bring a radio with you?" They knew that I was coming, that I was a ham, and there were people who were interested in ham radio and wanted to get a station going on the kibbutz. So this was just totally beautiful.
Why do you think they were interested in your ham radio station on the kibbutz at the time? And what year was this? This is like
1972. I think there was a lot of interest in ham radio in Israel at that time because Israel, these are the days before communication, internet, cheap telephone, all that stuff. So, and it was also very exciting, a link to the world. Israelis were always fascinated by people coming into the country from overseas. It took sometimes 2 years for the latest American movies to hit Israel. So ham radio was a big fascination. It's magic, ham radio. As we all know, everybody listening to this podcast knows what magic ham radio is. So there were a few people who were interested. They already knew some of the hams in Beersheba. So I got here, and when I went to get an Israeli call sign on the strength of my Canadian license, I also took out a club call sign for the kibbutz. We built a club station with the metal shop in the kibbutz, built antenna towers, and it was a whole story. It was really I Elmered a number of people. 3 people got call signs from my Elmering, which I think of them, 2 of them are still active today.
From the kibbutz.
Yeah.
You were an influence for change. What was it like to make a call to Canada in those days? What did you have to do in order to make a telephone call to Canada in the early 70s?
Well, it was almost unthinkable to make a telephone call because in the kibbutz, there were 2 telephones. In a community of about 600 people, 2 telephones. One in the main office of the kibbutz, and there was also a telephone booth outside, which worked on tokens that you had to, special tokens you had to buy, and it was a terrible telephone. You'd walk by, 100 meters away, hear people shouting into the telephone and to be heard, and and if you were on that telephone, you could hardly hear a whisper coming back at you. And to call outside of the country was almost unthinkable. I remember when the Yom Kippur War was on, and I arranged to have a call to call my folks and let them know I was okay. That was like a big event, and I'm sure it was very expensive. So ham radio, we used to, in fact, some parents of one of the kibbutz members, they donated money. We bought a TH6. At first we had a 2-element tri-band quad that we constructed from fiberglass arms. And then we were making phone patches for people. We used to sit a few nights a week in the station, and people would come and we'd contact. There was a net on 14320. I heard one of you, I think maybe Dov was talking about it a few weeks ago, the 4X net. So it was a good place for people, clearinghouse between Israel and overseas. So we'd make phone patches, and one of the members, the parents, donated and shipped a TH6 antenna over here. So then we got a really good antenna. And I remember also, well, of course, my folks were in Toronto, and I would be tuning around the bands, and I'd hear from Ismailia, Egypt. There was a station operating on the Suez Canal, which was a Canadian station from the Canadian UN forces. And they had stations lined up all across Canada to make phone patches for the troops. And so I got on a frequency and very quietly let them know I was there. I couldn't talk to the guy legally in Egypt at that time. But I said, you got anybody in Toronto who's free? Can I take them off frequency? And I got to know there was in Kingston, Ontario, at the Royal Military College, I don't recall the call sign there, but there was an officer cadet by the name of Keith, who was a ham. He was from Newfoundland. So they had a free telephone line from Kingston to Toronto, and they'd make phone patches for me. And one day I'm on that frequency, and I hear, "Hey, Ron." I said, "Yeah, this is Keith." So I said, "You know where I am?" I says, "No." I says, "I'm 100 miles or 100 kilometers." He was on the Suez Canal. We still couldn't legally talk, but he said, I got vacation leave coming. So I explained to him how to come, and he brought a bunch of guys, and began my association with the Canadian UN guys. They had always had at their bases in the Golan Heights and in Egypt and on the Suez Canal, they always had one ham who was a soldier. So his job was to run phone patches. Anyways, that started a whole association, and I became good friends with a guy out in Calgary, Willie, who spent a number of tours of service here. And he and his family were very good hosts, but that's another story.
And now this mid-show break. The future of podcasting and the QSO Today podcast is listener sponsorship. It keeps us lean and focused on providing you the best ham radio interviews since 2014. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial and sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. Listener sponsors, not donors, are automatically members of the new QSO Today Academy. I am building the Academy website to include access to our Sequel.io networking lounges all of the time and Academy resources including over 400 previous Expo presentations with Q&A and additional helpful ham radio educational resources. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Listener sponsorship allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that this is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with the episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations and the listener sponsorships that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that the QSO Today project will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now we return to our QSO Today. So you had an amateur radio station at your kibbutz. Well, what did the rest of Israel look like, ham radio-wise? Was there a lot of active amateurs?
It's interesting, and I think there were. I remember when we knew the Beersheba group of amateurs. We'd drive into Beersheba. There was Emmanuel 4X4, 4X1, later GV, who was very instrumental. There was a number of other amateurs who were very helpful, and hams, I suppose, everywhere are very much giving with equipment, helping out. And at that time, it was in the mid-'70s, 2 meters started to come in, and that sort of brought people a lot more together. There was the Saturday morning 40-meter get-together. People would be on 40 meters on Saturday morning, and that was a good grounds for meeting people. When 2 meters came in, it opened things up wide. I remember going to the first annual membership meeting of the Israel Amateur Radio Club in Tel Aviv one time, but I didn't really know anybody yet. But with 2 meters, it opened things up. And the first 2-meter gear was Motorola surplus gear, which was retired from the police and was given freely or to the hams through the Israel Amateur Radio Club. And they put up repeaters. And then the synthesized radio started coming in later on in the 70s. So you didn't have to rely on a few crystals. And then things opened up even more. I remember buying my first Yaesu FT227RA, I believe it was. And I put up a nice 2-meter beam in order to hit the repeaters. And then there was the Jerusalem. There was a clear shot into Jerusalem, 90 kilometers from here, with the repeater up on the water tower in Beit Vegan, western neighborhood of Jerusalem. And there were a lot of English-speaking hams, I guess still are in Jerusalem, and other Hebrew-speaking hams as well. But the 2 meters opened it up, and once you talk to people, then you want to come and visit them. And I became more and more active, meeting people. And I remember I was already getting pretty well known. I think, now I don't remember what came first, but I think it was the annual membership assembly of the Israel Amateur Radio Club in 1982, when the old committee was, or executive, decided they had enough and they wanted to clear the way for a new executive to take their place. And Aaron Kirshner, 4X4, later 4X1AT, said, what about Mookie Kookie? They called me Mookie Kookie. That was MK, Mike Kilo. So, why don't you go on the executive? Well, it turned out to be a total bust because I lived so far away to get up to the executive meetings, and many times they're all the way up in Haifa. So I didn't get to too many, but they suggested that I write the English language column for the Israel Amateur Radio Club magazine. So this was the beginning of my journalistic career, as I recall. Now, I think that came first, and later they got a letter from 73 magazine. And 73 magazine wanted international correspondence. And they had an international column every month with maybe, I don't know, actually, if the pages were 3 or 4 columns on a page, so maybe 1.5 columns with each country. They put the flag of the country. So I became their Israeli correspondent. So I started writing about Israel Ham Radio. I still have all these magazines and piles of magazines. I don't know how many years that went on, but I think I wrote a pretty good picture of amateur radio in Israel for 73 magazine. At the same time, I was also writing for the Hagal, the Israel Amateur Radio Club magazine, the English language summary of what was going on. And then Aaron Kirshner, I think we're already getting into the later 1980s, he wanted that this should be a newsletter that we'd send out monthly. No matter Hagal, the magazine came out, which means the wave, by the way. That magazine came out erratically, in true Israeli fashion. Not
when it was convenient.
Things are very loose when you got enough articles or whatever. So maybe it came out. It was supposed to, well, now it's coming out once every 2 months. But then it depends on who the editor was, how many articles he could scrape together. But he said, and Aaron he was born in Germany, and the Germans are known for being very punctual and very much sticking to order and things like that. He wanted that we should have an international newsletter from Israel coming out every month. And so we started a collaboration on this together. And this was also using packet radio for the first time, hooking up the old XT computer, at that time still diskettes for the DOS on it, and whatever, and collaborating using packet to send the text back and forth, and then he'd print it out, and then they'd mail it out once a month to all the radio societies and magazines and anybody who subscribed. That was, I think, my journalistic career, if we can call it that.
I think you were writing the English language portion of Hagal up until recently, right? Last year or the year before?
Yeah, I did it for more than 20 years.
Yeah, how about that? For those of us that aren't great Hebrew readers, I like the column in the back.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. I did get feedback, even from Hebrew-speaking people, who told me they seemed to get a better picture in those few words of English than from the... But I don't think that's quite true. Maybe they didn't take the effort to read all the Hebrew in the magazine.
Well, there's some amazing hams in Israel, and there were some amazing ham engineers in Israel that would put together some really fine articles in Hebrew, but there were also reprints of articles translated into Hebrew from the big magazines, with obviously with their permission. But that was a big endeavor for anyone trying to translate from the mainline American magazines and put those into the Hagal.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of thanks has to go to Michael Michael, 4X1 Kilo Fox, who has been the editor of Hagal for many years already, and he is very, very fastidious. Not the word, very but he translates lots of articles. And he was also a big proponent of CW. So he, before the CW finally got dropped from the requirements for the license.
I wanted to go back and touch on Motorola for just a second, because you talked about the use of Motorola surplus gear from police cars. I think that one thing that maybe most folks don't know is that Motorola was one of the earliest American corporations into Israel in the early 60s. A lot of engineers at Engineering Center here in Israel were ham radio operators. Do you know anything more about that?
Not too much, although I know that a lot of Motorola gear was being manufactured here, and that later on, I don't recall what year, Motorola sponsored the Israel Amateur Radio Club, and for many years had donated some rooms in their building for IARC offices and a meeting room. And that went on for quite a few years until they downsized a bit, and we did get thrown out. But still, Motorola was very generous, and also I have to say that most of the repeaters in Israel, I don't know about now, probably not so much now, but for many, many years, they were all donated by Motorola. What's his name? David Shmueli.
Yeah.
What's his call sign? I just met him yesterday and shook hands with him at the field day. I've lost it. I'm sorry. I can't forget I don't remember his call sign at the moment. He was a Motorola technician, real whiz, and he'd be all over the place tweaking the repeaters. And a lot of the repeaters were also on Motorola sites. So I think we really, as the Yiddish word schnorred, we begged or what's the word, sponged a lot off of Motorola.
I think Motorola was very generous to Israeli hams, and I think Israeli hams were big contributors to the brain trust that was over at Motorola for many years. I think what ended up happening was that Motorola decided to move out of Tel Aviv, and they moved to offices near the airport, and the Israel Amateur Radio Club just didn't go with them at that point.
Okay, I don't know, because I'm out here in the Negev, so even though that I was, kind of tied in with things, and I have to say, well, there were a few years that I was in Tel Aviv, and this sort of will carry on. If you'll allow me to backtrack a bit, just to get the story, go on with the story. So about the career, okay? Now, ham radio still had a part in my career, because after a few years in the kibbutz, working in agriculture and the field crops, there was a guy here, one of the electricians decided he wanted to leave the kibbutz. And they were looking for somebody to replace him. And hey, this guy's a ham. He plays with radio and electronics and stuff. So I asked, do you want to become an electrician? So I said, fine. So I started to work as an electrician. They sent me to a course to get my electrician's license at the Rupin Institute, which today it's an academic institute near Netanya, and it was a live-in course, a very concentrated course. And what was funny was I was then 27 years old, and the difference that 10 years makes, that all the mathematics and all that stuff which had daunted me, everything seemed to make sense. No problem understanding power factors, and I don't know how involved the mind was more settled. I think also I was very fortunate. This was also a friend of mine in Canada, was a ham, had come across transcendental meditation, which is an excellent exercise for calming the mind and allowing you to solve problems, to figure things out more, and just not be tense. So that maybe made a contribution to, I'm sure it made a contribution to my ability to understand and work through problems much better. So the electrician's course was a breeze, and I really got into being an electrician, which was a nice perk from that, is that in the workshop, I could use that for my ham radio equipment, ham radio projects. We also, one of the things that we did, we made television antennas for the members of the kibbutz. At that time, there was all this aluminum profile and all these fittings that you purchased pretty cheaply, and they were also great for building UHF and VHF antennas.
I think it's worthwhile pointing out that the kibbutz has, since it's kind of a self-contained entity, that you had all kinds of shop tools of various kinds, metal, wood, electric, all that kind of stuff, to be able to do any kind of project that you wanted. Did you have an electronics shop as well, where you had some test equipment?
Not per se. There was in the factory, we have a factory here which developed later on, they did have an electronic lab. There was one guy who was an electronics engineer, and taking part, because in their machinery they had electronic controls, microprocessors as time went on. Maybe we should just first of all, and we didn't do this at the beginning, my fault, that a kibbutz is a small community. Maybe you could call it a commune, where it's basically self-contained, although it does have commerce with the outside, like it doesn't raise all its own food. It's not like one of these communes, very ideological communes in the States, where they'd raise all their own food. But still, especially in the earlier years, almost everybody working on the kibbutz, we didn't have any outside help. As time went on, they started hiring people from the outside, and things started to change. But everything self-contained. We had a big central dining room where you'd go 3 times a day for meals, actually 4 times a day. You get up in the morning at 6 a.m. and there'd be coffee and bread and jam before you went out to work, and then there'd be breakfast at 8, there'd be lunch, and there'd be dinner. You didn't really have to cook your own food. Our own laundry, where your clothes were laundered and folded and ironed. In the case, also they repair your clothes, and then the different education. We had our own school, our own kindergartens, also our own child care center, and then the metal shop for building and fixing things. Our own building crew taking care of building and repairing. Then, of course, electricians. There's the garage that would take care of fixing tractors and cars.
The job of the kibbutz was agriculture in the early years, right?
Yeah.
So all of these activities were actually supporting the agricultural operations of the kibbutz.
Yes, the operations were outside of the main thing is being a community,
mm-hmm.
and then the community supports itself mainly through agriculture. We had one small factory at that time which made knives. Then it turned into making screwdrivers, and then we bought another factory which was a textile factory. So that there was a bit of light industry. Some kibbutzim are based today mainly on industry. I think, agriculture isn't such a profitable business anymore in this country for the most part. So you have to, if you really want to stay alive, you got to take up some kind of industry.
Right. So there was this shift in the kibbutz movement to start creating specialty factories or specialty ideas. Your kibbutz, does it have some specialized industry now?
Well, the knives, that business folded. A lot of stuff. We have a factory which uses synthetic fibers and makes basically stuffing for used to make blankets and coats, but the textile of that sort labor was cheaper outside, and with globalization, textile industry got killed in a lot of countries where better wages were paid. But that factory is making stuff which is not manual labor concentrated. And I think, that's the main factory. We also have another factory which makes stuff from plastic. It makes it was a jewelry box factory which we bought from some Italian firm, and they've sort of branched out a bit. It's not the most profitable thing in the world. I think this kibbutz is more experts at losing money than making money, but that's another story.
Well, I think what's interesting here is that I think, as the kibbutzim realized that agriculture in the long term may not be sustainable, they became very entrepreneurial in terms of trying to discover what their niche was, and even doing some really cutting-edge technology. That's not all of them, but many of them, I think, were doing some very interesting things here that ultimately led to kibbutz businesses, that some of them becoming international.
Oh, yeah. There's a very successful kibbutz near Beersheba, Hatzerim. They developed the drip irrigation technique. And so they have factories all over the world now. And then here's a kibbutz with some kind of laser operation. I'm not sure exactly what they do. There's biotechnology in some kibbutzim. And so on. What you can think of, it probably exists someplace.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. What are your current rigs?
Okay, my main rig is a Yaesu Fox Tango 920. I also have a Kenwood FT, not a TS830, which is I really have to, whatever. That's just I have a Yaesu FT817 little QRP radio, and then I got some VHF UHF gear. I had played actually with amateur satellites for a while too. I think we're going to get back on track about amateur radio with your kind permission. That in this hobby there are so many interesting things, and I was very fortunate that all kinds of things intermeshed. And this was actually when in 1984 to 87, I spent most of my time in Tel Aviv at art school. The kibbutz allowed me to study art and financed me through art school. The kibbutz at that time allowed all members to get some kind of course of academic study, whatever they wanted. And while I was in art school in Tel Aviv, so there are lots of hams around Tel Aviv, and I got to know so many people there. And at one stage, there was a series of lectures given by Yair 4X4GI on amateur satellites. And this is in the mid to later 1980s. This was around the time of Oscar 10, when Oscar 10 was going up. So once a week I'd go up to the Tel Aviv University in the evening for this lecture. And it was fascinating about the high orbit satellites, which get up there to about 40,000 kilometers away from the Earth. And for a few hours, it's virtually sitting in one spot. You point your antenna and work half the globe. And this fascinated me. So I slowly started to see what I could scrounge on my limited budget. And I gradually got together a UHF multimode and a VHF multimode built a helical antenna for 70 centimeters and cross Yagis for 2 meters with circularized polarization. And doing all of this, you learn a lot too. You're building all the stuff. And I remember getting an Oscar 10 was totally amazing. Well, I didn't have the helix finished or the azimuth, not the azimuth, the elevation rotator set up yet. So I was just using my 2 meter and UHF antenna, which was actually a television log periodic. But when Oscar 13 at one stage when it would come up, maybe once every 10 days or something, would be sitting opposite those antennas for a few hours. So I was able to make contacts on it. Then I got the antenna set up, and this was like being born again. The thrill, just like your first contact, with 25 watts. You're talking on SSB with some guy in Guam on the other side of the world, or with the biggest thrill. And that was when I worked KH6IJ, Dr. Katashi knows. So I remember back in the 60s, he used to write articles in QST, and he was like the big guru of satellites, and I don't know if moonbounds, but definitely satellites, or hearing signals from the moon on my 70 centimeter setup coming from Algonquin Park, big dish of the radio telescope there that was run by, I think, the E3ASO, who was somebody I worked and knew on 2 meters when I lived in Toronto. And he passed on, sadly, but he operated 1 weekend for the some UHF or VHF contest, the big dish in Algonquin Park, and I was able to hear him from here, which was a total blast. That's the best DX ever for me, whatever. So that's basically the gear. And I got a smattering of handy talkies. We seem to always accumulate handy talkies. Now I've ordered a DMR handy talkie. So we're going to find out what this thing is all about. They put up a DMR repeater in Beersheba. We should be able to access that, no problem.
Are you still operating satellites?
No. When we moved after I got married and to another house, and I decided to put up a tower. I couldn't put up on that the satellite stuff and HF, and I decided at that time I think Oscar 13 had demised. Unfortunately, they're good when they last, but when it's gone, it's gone. Suddenly, it isn't a matter that the sunspots are going to come back. To put up, they were going to put up another Oscar of not the low Earth orbit, but the high Earth ones. They're really good DX satellites. And I think they put something up, but it didn't work when the stuff was, or the rocket blew up. I don't remember the story. I'm sure your listeners know better than I do. So I put up I always liked quads. So I put up a big 2-element quad, which I laced for 5 bands with some, with a VHF Yagis and the UHF antenna in the middle. And that's what I'm basically doing. And then I also played around. Another fascination of mine was 160 meters. Way back from Canada, I remember when I got the DX100B. So I tried 160. Of course, that's a challenging band. And when they opened up 160 meters in Israel around the time when the WARC bands came in, and I had bought the TS830, I decided I was definitely got to give 160 meters a chance. In those days, it was much better, because today we have so much RF pollution that if you want to get out today, you've got to operate a linear just about. 160 meters, the English hams were allowed only 10 watts, yet there was no problem working them on 160 meters. I remember one night there was an opening into the east coast of the United States. I worked a log page of stations on 160 meters with 100 watts, all in all, that's all. And a inverted L antenna, that the top of the antenna was about maybe 15 meters above the ground at the best, maybe 12, 15 meters. I had one radio running in the ground. So between up to 160 meters and satellite work, and then the packet radio, and that was basically my only digital experiment at that time. packet radio came into Israel, and this was a good introduction to computers too. At that time, I would say packet radio is the best computer game for a ham.
Well, that may be true. Is there a amateur packet network in Israel even still?
I'm not the right person to ask. I don't know if there is. There might be a packet cluster, but I just can't say anything with any authority on that.
What are you operating now?
So I'm operating now the FT920, the two-element quad. I have a ZEP antenna, which is basically like an 80-meter dipole, which I'm fed in the middle with a twin lead going to a antenna tuner. So I operate that from 80, 40, 60, and 30 meters, and use the quad for the higher bands. And then I have the Yagis for 2 meters and 70 centimeters.
And is the quad a homebrew quad?
Excellent question. I used to homebrew all my antennas. I took pride, and the only commercial antenna I had was the rubber ducky on my handy. However, so many years go on, and I built, for example, a 3-band delta loop, 2-element delta loop. And I remember spending the whole summer climbing up and down the pole and adjusting. So, I'm getting a little older now. I think I can afford, maybe also spiritually, to buy an antenna. So I ordered GemQuad from Canada, because I know GemQuads were always pretty good. When the and it was supposed to work on 5 bands. When the GemQuad arrived, so they gave you instructions how to build it as a 3-band quad. Then they had suggestions how to feed it as a 5-band quad, but nothing nothing concrete, just suggestions what you might try. So I found it was like using their structure and going back into the whole thing. In the end, I found the website of John Tate in Ireland, EI7BA, and used his parameters and built a 5-band quad with separate feed lines coming down to the base of the tower with relays, which I'd switch there to one coax coming into the shack. So can you say that's a commercial antenna? Well, yes and no.
Inspired by a commercial design, perhaps.
Well, basically quads are quads. The GemQuad is a beautiful structure. It's a spider quad. It's in the middle. There are these 3. Each arm is made of 3, I think, 6-millimeter fiberglass rods with some kind of something bonding them together, spacing them. Very strong. You just have to protect it against the UV. But my quad's been up now for 19 years, and one of the guys, by the way, that I used learning. You always learn more about something after you've built it and realize what you should have done. Then you know what you should have done, and you didn't do it at the beginning. So I came across the website of LB Sebic. I try to remember W4RNL, and he passed on a number of years ago. But there is a wealth of information about antennas and all kinds of research he did with antenna modeling, and that man is right on. Whatever he says, that's the gospel truth as far as I'm concerned.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
I'd say a very big impact, at least at the beginning, because I had absolutely no family life. I was a certified nerd, and retreated from girls and stayed in my shack. And I was pretty much until at a certain stage in life when I kind of opened up and started to explore the other sex. But so I would say I might have been married much earlier when I did meet my wife, and she also had not been married before. We married in our later 30s. So I like to say when my friends who've been divorced and were remarrying, that's when we married. So I say I never did the first marriage, only the second marriage. So that was the impact of ham radio. My son, probably as a baby, he heard the Morse coming from the other room from Oscar 13 when I was doing my first communications, and his ears would perk up when he'd hear the CW coming through.
Are you still a CW operator?
Yes.
Is that your favorite mode?
I don't say favorite because I guess whatever I'm doing at the time, that's what I'm doing. So I'm favoring it at that moment. So I really don't like to put one against the other. Yet I do like Morse a lot. I'm an amateur musician, and Morse is like music. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge. Just recently, I've started challenging myself more with it. A good Morse QSO is satisfying like a good handshake. When you got when you're getting up there at a speed where you can converse very freely and not just give your gear the weather and then go on to the next contact, which after a while becomes rather tiresome and feel like a waste of time. When you can actually experience the other person, and you can do this, of course, on SSB, on voice, it's much easier. On Morse, it's really nice. And being a bit of a musician, I find it a challenge. And just recently, I discovered that ARRL has its code practice sessions on MP3 files that you can download. So I put these into my MP3 player when I'm doing my daily constitutional walk. I challenged myself listening to the higher speed CW. At this stage of the game now, I'm starting to be able to understand 35 words per minute. 30 is pretty good. 25 is bread and butter. But and 40, I'm just picking up a word here or there. But I think that's also a challenge. I always, when you got CW as working as a language, then it's a big thrill. Yet having said that, voice is beautiful. I think I used a lot of CW because I never used much high power. I didn't have a big gun station, so Morse came more into it. Yet when the conditions are in there and you got good conditions, you can work somebody on SSB from the other part of the world. It's a big thrill to work guys in the States who are just using dipoles and 100 watts from here. And then and this is so important, we have to remember that although we're ham radio and radio hams, this whole hobby is about people. And when you work somebody, I would ask everybody, think, after you tell them what the weather is and what your radios are, don't go away. Say, what do you do? How old are you? What interests you? And you'll find it's interesting that most people are not rag chewers, but they want to be rag chewers. You ask them a few questions, and somebody was just going to QRT and said QRU or something, they'll suddenly open up if you hit them with the right question. People want to talk. People want to, we're operating on the radio. Is there somebody out there? And when you get to really feel there's somebody out there. I once talked to some guy in Uganda. I thought, what a spiritual person. Wow, I felt like this guy's my brother. And he'll allow me to continue this thought because, I studied philosophy and mysticism and stuff like that. And I think that ham radio is really a spiritual hobby. I remember reading some books by a guy who was a supposed Tibetan Lama, if it's true or not, but he talked about astral traveling. And I thought, well, doggone it. We're astral traveling with our radios. We're going up there around in space, meeting people, coming and making this contact with people. And it's a meeting of minds. It's a meeting of spirits. And if we're just using it to exchange QSL cards and do one-upmanship on somebody else that I got more countries and more certificates than you, then I think we're missing the whole point of it. And we're wasting so much of this fantastic resource we have. So pardon me for being on the soapbox about that, but I thought it was important to say.
We go to a lot of trouble to either build rigs, modify rigs, upgrade rigs, acquire them. And the purpose of that is to make that connection, that human connection. So I'm actually glad you brought it up and brought it up in the way that you did. What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, there's a lot of really interesting things going on. But for me personally, what excites me is the same thing as people. It's that contact. There's a lot of really neat stuff. I have to admit, the last number of years I've been more involved in my creative activities with art, with painting, and doing music. So I haven't involved myself. I've played around a little bit. I tried to set up a dongle to watch the IF of my radio, but there was too much noise on the thing, and I didn't carry through with it. I really felt I wanted to spend more time practicing on the keyboards and stuff like that. So I've sort of neglected a lot of this technical stuff, but it's still on the burner. I want to try some of this stuff. There's not enough time in life for all these fantastic things that there are to do in this life. Ham radio is one of them, and I've been so blessed that, in fact, ham radio, I was talking about networking. So I remember one day, after getting onto the Facebook page for the Israel Blues Association, I get a call from a guy, and he says, "Are you the same guy who's known as Mookie Kookie, 4X1MK, one of the guys from the Israel Blues Association?" I says, "Yes." So my father and I remember you. I'm 4X6VJ, and he's one of the main guys behind the Israel Blues Association. Invited me to come up to jam session they have in Tel Aviv once a month. And I came up there. I was just immediately felt love, and people love this music and playing. So it opened up a whole world, meeting musicians and getting musically active, and that's ham radio. I think just about everything I've done in my life, so many of my friends, even if the friendship might not be about ham radio is connected, or they're hams, or something came together through ham radio. But ham radio is like in the rope of my life is one of the smaller ropes which is braided in through everything else.
It's amazing that ham radio connects us, but it doesn't necessarily have to be about ham radio. Could be something about something else, but it's that door opener. What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Right. Well, I thought about this a little bit because that's what you ask everybody, of course, and I was trying to think if I had something really neat to say to somebody which wasn't said before. But actually now, I would just hit on this before, and I would say it again. Get to know the people. Make the human contact. And outside of that, just find out what's going on. There's so many fascinating things in ham radio. Maybe you're not a people person, and that's all right. Maybe more of a builder or somebody with technical stuff. It's all good, or all of them. But find out there's so much great stuff going on that there's something for everybody. And I guess I've dabbled with most of the stuff in ham radio during my life. Not everything. There's a number of things still to be done, and I probably will never get around to them. But there's so much there that you can generally always find something that you can be passionate about. The important thing is that it's something that turns you on, that attracts you, that makes you feel good, that makes you feel you're doing something with your life, and you're not just watching TV or doing something, filling out crossword puzzles are good. They exercise the mind. I shouldn't put that down, but so I won't. But just find something that you can be passionate about and check it all out.
Ron, I want to thank you for coming on the QSO Today podcast with me. I'd like to share the Israeli hams every once in a while with my audience because this is where I live, and it's a different context, but, there's many of us English speakers who came here and are active and invested in Israeli ham radio. So I'm glad you took the time out to speak to me more about it. So with that, I want to wish you 73.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. This has been an opportunity for me to review this basically my life, because ham radio is, I say, intertwined with my whole life. And as far as Israel ham radio, we're just another country, and we're part of the whole big world. And coming to Israel for me was just to be a regular guy and not be a part of a minority, but to just be a regular guy. And I think that like my Friday night conflict was solved by just being, in Israel and being a ham like any other ham. And I think that's what Israel is all about, just for the people to become normal and be as any other people.
I thank you very much. 73.
All the best, Eric. Thank you. And all the best blessings to all your listeners.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope you enjoyed this QSO with Tony. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in G4WIF in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.